We're really psyched to have an alum here, Laura Engeman, to talk about her coastal resilience work. She's been based in Southern California doing some really, pretty cutting edge stuff, and worked with the Center for the Blue Economy a number of years back. So we've had a long-standing relationship with Laura. And, just again, a shout to everybody here that, blue economy for us is all about restorative, sustainable, not just the business as usual approach. And I know that's what Laura is interested in as well. So let's give her a warm welcome. And Laura, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. I'm excited to see you guys. I am a Miss alum, and I am very proud to be a Miss alum. And Jason was definitely an influence in terms of my career and thought process going forward. So much appreciated. And I've had a few Miss interns, I was saying in the past. I hope that I can host a few more or find partnerships with you guys. There's tons of work to be had out in the coastal resilience and sea level rise space, and there's more coming. So yeah, I'm gonna focus my talk a little bit actually on what I think are some emerging new fields and emerging kind of work areas around sea level rise that you guys might not know about, and then kind of some of the projects that I'm involved with that relate to those. So I think I have to jump back to not the best at the Google slide deck, but I'll do my best here. Everybody okay? Okay. So I have a really long title, mainly preparing for a new coastal future is what you guys should care about. So I work for, I have a bridge position, and I work for Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where I mostly work with what's called the Center for Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation. And the director of that is a coastal oceanographer that specializes in sea level rise science and flooding hazards. So I work a lot with his team. And then I also have a joint position with California Sea Grant. And so the focus of my work is really at that intersection between researchers and then communities, state, local, nonprofit, all sorts of different communities, and what they sort of need in terms of understanding today's coastal hazards, future coastal hazards, how to adapt to those. And so I spend a lot of time at the university trying to understand what the latest and greatest science is and what capabilities there are in terms of data and new stuff coming out. And then I spend a lot of time with communities. So I am currently on the California Sea Level Rise Task Force, helping to co-author the new state sea level rise guidance. And I think the draft should be out maybe this week, maybe the next week. I haven't heard quite yet. So that's exciting. And then I do things like sit on the city of San Diego's coastal resilience planning efforts, city of Oceanside, a lot of mostly Southern California work, but also tell you about some of the binational work that I'm doing. And then at Sea Grant, we're also sponsoring a brand new position up in Mendocino and Fort Bragg, also focused on blue economy and coastal resilience. So lots of intersections with you guys. So I just wanted to share kind of who I am. This is pretty good image on the right. This is a lot of what I spend my time doing with my researchers. Is we are focused on better understanding, like, what are the drivers behind flooding in terms of sea level rise, but also wave tidal conditions, and how can we sort of understand how big floods are going to be and be able to provide communities with better forecasts and better predictions of when that's going to happen. And so some of that involves running out in the field to see if our predictions are correct and if things are going to flood as bad as we think they are. So this is me down at Cardiff, which is in Encinitas. On the left is the sand fencing for the brand new living shoreline that's been built there at Cardiff. And then you can see the flooding that kind of came through the walkways of that dune living shoreline through. So there were some big waves, high tides that day. So we expected it to flood. So, and then the left, this is the core of my team at Sea Grant these days, although I'm adding some more. Jenna Wisniewski is on the right. She is a staff research associate with me, and she is now running most of the coastal dune, the California Dune Science Network. I'll talk a little bit about what that is. And on the left is Melissa Lee Alvarado. She is a 2-year extension fellow with me at Sea Grant, and she's focused on building Northern Baja and San Diego research and knowledge sharing partnerships to support coastal resilience on both sides of the border. So, why do I feel like, okay. So what I want to talk about with you guys today is a little bit about what there is in the world of sea level rise, like I said, careers, and also the different aspects of understanding what we're sort of doing with sea level rise information and how it's being used. So I wanted to, most people like to start with the future 2100, what sea level rise is going to look like in the future. And I actually like to flip the script, because what we should care about in our communities is what's going to happen in the near term. So I'm going to talk a lot about near term, midterm, and long term, because these are really important time frames for understanding what we as communities still have time to do, to act and to respond and to sort of adapt and plan and re-envision our coast. So at my heart, I'm a little bit of a hopeful optimist, although I have a bit of cynicism on the other side. But in my work, I do believe, we are facing some pretty drastic climate change threats, but at the same time, there is still a lot of hope for how we work together, use the knowledge that we have, use the community resources that we have, and really, do a better job of making the coast a special place for everyone. So I wanted to start with this idea of the emerging careers. One place that is really coming out is what I guess I would call coastal monitoring for adaptive planning. And what I mean by that is we have these projections and these models that we're given in terms of how sea level rise is going to increase flooding and erosion. And the thing to remember with sea level rise is it is actually an accelerator of existing coastal hazards. So when we see things flood, it's not necessarily 100% sea level rise, although in the future it might be, but it is a combination of things. It's a combination of the fact that we have potentially elevated sea levels, meaning like during El Niños, we also get higher sea levels. And then it's also waves, in which we have a lot of waves in California, as most of you know. It can be high tides. And so whenever we have high tides or king tides, as you guys have heard about, then we often do see a little bit of flooding and some overtopping. When we have high tides and we have big waves, then we see even more flooding. And then when we add even half a foot of sea level rise, that means that the water is able to get up even higher over the top of infrastructure and sort of flood extent further. So there are a couple different ways that we talk about flooding. What I just described to you with those three combined effects are sort of when we have all those extremes, like the highest tide, the biggest waves, and the more elevated sea levels, we term those like the more extreme end of flooding. But then we also have what we call high tide flooding, which is often referred to as sunny day flooding. This is generally more tide driven. So it just means we have higher tides with maybe elevated sea levels. And as sea level rise begins to happen in the next couple of decades, the chances for that high tide flooding to increase is going to, it's going to increase by quite a bit. And what this means to us is that we like to picture sea level rise as being this sort of ultimate end game of everything is underwater. But in reality, the way sea level rise is going to manifest for us in California in particular is going to be that we're going to see more and more flooding events, bigger flooding events, and more intense flooding events as the decades go on. So this graph on the left is really a demonstration of how Even minor flooding, as we call it, like nuisance flooding, is expected to increase in the San Diego area between now and 2050. And you'll see that there's a pretty big jump. Right now, it's like approximately 1 day a year. And by 2043, it could be up to 50 days a year. And for us on the coast, the reason that we care about this flood frequency is partly because that starts to chip away at our coast and starts to make our coast more vulnerable in general, and then even more vulnerable during these extreme events. And part of that is frankly our fault. We have developed all the way up to the coast, and we expect things to survive what are natural processes, like I said, natural coastal hazards that come and go in California. Part of it is that we've reduced our sand on our beaches, and we can't really get that back. But at the same time, we are seeing this increase in flooding. And so a big component to what we need, how we adapt to sea level rise, is really understanding how often these flooding events are happening, how much damage they're causing, how they're impacting communities, how they're impacting coastal access. And so a lot of this really plays into what we do about sea level rise. So on the right, you'll see Capistrano Beach, which is just north of me. And that's actually not a king tide. It was just more of a spring tide, but it was a fairly big summer swell. So then why do we care about this in terms of what we do, how we plan for sea level rise? Is at the same time that we see this frequency, and I just showed you up to 2050, which is that near term, we're really only expected to get about a foot of sea level rise between now and 2050. But you saw how much flooding, high tide flooding, and flooding in general may increase with just 1 foot of sea level rise. Now, if you jump to 2070 and 2100, I'm going to encourage you not to look necessarily just at the high numbers, but actually the intermediate numbers. The intermediate is where sort of all of the prediction, the most climate models diverge, meaning that's the most models come out at around that input, and then the other higher numbers are plausible numbers, but we don't know if they're very dependent on very high emissions, high global warming, and a huge amount of ice sheet melt. So the intermediate is considered a pretty plausible scenario. So see at 2070, you're looking at 1.4, almost 1.5 feet. And then you see this big jump in 2100 up to 3 feet. And so that's basically a doubling of sea level rise. So these numbers, I like to talk about, these numbers don't necessarily sound drastic, but I think the point is it doesn't actually take a lot of increase in sea level to start to see those fairly drastic changes in flood frequency and erosion of our coast. So what we care about are on the bottom. Here's your graphics for today, or your plots. On the bottom is a tool that's now available on NASA sealevel.gov. I help advise some of the NASA researchers on sort of their practitioner tools. So I'm excited about this one. And essentially, this is a lot of the work that I'm also doing in my shop with some students. This is the coastal monitoring component. So how can communities start to understand what their baseline is for how many days they might have flooding right now, and how that's increasing as we start to move into the next decade? So this is the San Diego area. These are based on tide gauges, not actually shoreline flooding, but it's still decent observation. And you can see on the bottom graph from 1980, those two big bars are the big El Nino, 82 and 83. And then you start to see quite a few more flooding events as you get towards 2020. So this is really important because we as communities have to start to understand what our thresholds are for flooding in order to figure out where we want to prioritize our adaptations and our investments in addressing sea level rise. And these are the physical data that we care about, like how many times do we think it's actually flooding, but the socioeconomic, like how people are impacted in terms of roads, what roads can be elevated, what the economic damages are of closed businesses. These are all things that should be combined with this information to really get us to understand as communities, maybe one road can flood 10 times a year and it's no big deal because there's a whole bunch of different other routes to take. But there may be another critical road that the buses use in main public transportation or the railroad, as is the case down here in San Diego that we're dealing with, where that's a critical piece of infrastructure. And if it floods even twice a year, that's a big problem. So it's really starting to think about the sort of socioeconomic aspects and what we call like sensitivities to these exposures, as well as the frequency of these exposures going forward. That's going to help drive how we can be smart sort of sea level rise planners into the future. On the top, I just added because I wanted to also note that we care not just about mean sea level, which is what the projections are sort of based on your average sea level, but just remembering that sea levels are not static, right? They move up and down every single day with the tides. They move seasonally. They move also with the sort of decadal cycles. And so when we do averages, especially here in California where we have extreme tides, you're also sort of missing all like what the extremes are. So at the top, what we care about is not just how the average sea level is moving, but we also care about the top graph, which shows the maximum water levels that were reached. And you also see that that trend line is going up. And so we're reaching higher and higher elevations with the water level, which is why we see flooding. So in that realm, with the coastal monitoring piece, there's a lot of different opportunities here. Community science has been one of those pieces that I think has been challenging in the past to integrate with more traditional research. However, now observations, photographs, videos, drones are really being helpful to validate what we're seeing in terms of flood events, and also to validate some of the models that are being used to sort of predict these things. So an increasing capacity at our Scripps group, the Coastal Processes group, is really working with communities to get their sort of photos from these events, to get narratives about what happened during these events, and to really see if we can continue to sort of tweak our predictions and help them with understanding how things are changing into the future. So helping them create this baseline and then understanding what's changing. So this is just a couple examples. On the right is, again, the Cardiff Dunes. That's the very toe edge of the dunes there, where that's sort of being washed away. So we're interested in understanding how those dunes are holding up. So this is actually me and a colleague that are out there kind of taking a look at the dunes and what's happening there as the waves are coming up. And on the left is the city of Del Mar. A bunch of our field techs were out in the city of Del Mar. This is all from this January 2023 event. And then below, you'll see a couple of quotes from the field techs, just noting, again, glass panels in the front of the house. So houses were impacted and damaged. Sand steps, coastal access was damaged. So my job, they care about the validation of the models. I care about how do we integrate this into sort of storylines that communities are starting to actually hold in their sort of library of information to use going forward, and to start that narrative with their community about how things are changing and how fast things are changing. And that's really important to get buy-in for our sea level rise adaptation strategies. And it's really important for communities to understand, and have that reconnection to the coast about how their coast is being changed over time, how it changes seasonally. And so sort of if I would say, a relearning of the fact that it's a dynamic system. It's not always static. We like our groomed, pretty beaches in Southern California, but that's not really the way the system goes. So sort of reteaching that. So why do we care about all this? And this kind of gets me into the second sort of emerging area, which is coastal planning and kind of experimental adaptation. So adaptation pathway planning, or dynamic adaptation pathway planning, I think I said a link to the Marilyn Hasnut paper, which is kind of the gold standard for understanding the initial thoughts around dynamic adaptation pathway planning, but this is becoming very popular in California as well as other parts of the world. And essentially, the idea is that you saw in the near term, we kind of know what our sea level rise impact is going to be because we know where we're going to be with global warming by 2050. We kind of know what countries have committed to in terms of emissions and policy. But thankfully, to Jason and others that are pushing blue economy concepts and more policy, there's still room in that midterm and long-term projections of sea level rise. The highest end, as I mentioned, are extremely emission and global warming dependent. So that means that we can avoid those highest numbers of sea level rise. We still have time. We can actually do something about it. And so there is some uncertainty about how high our sea level rise is going to get. And with that means that our communities still have to plan 50 to sometimes 100 years out ahead. So what they do is adaptation pathway planning, meaning that it looks something crazy like this. If you're very complex, this is the county of San Mateo. Essentially, all you need to know is just follow the little red lines. The first one is, this would be their strategy to, buffer the road. And then it moves down as you start to see more impacts and higher sea levels. You start to shift into more aggressive strategies. And then you may have several strategies as your options. You'll see the dollar signs, so how much they cost, whether they're sort of helping coastal habitat might be a consideration. And then you'll see the box in the sort of middle that says trigger to initiate strategy. So that's the piece that I care about the most, because essentially those pieces are tied to the science and the coastal monitoring. So as I mentioned, if we tie a policy of we're going to move a road back and we tie it to a certain number of days of flooding or a certain duration of flooding, then we have to have a strategy in place to actually monitor that and be able to use that to drive the policy change. If our cliff is eroded, we have to know how much our cliff is eroded. And right now, frankly, our communities in California are not quite equipped to do this. So many are starting to think about it, but we're moving into a realm of how can we actually enable our communities to monitor this. And we can do some great new things with satellites, which we're starting to be able to monitor shoreline change and things in rural communities, which is great that we could never do before with satellites. But then the other pieces, as I mentioned, are very on the ground. So it can't, a lot of that takes community engagement, sort of volunteer support, and people like yourselves, students, universities. It takes partnership to really get out there and start monitoring what's happening and collect that information. And so this was just an example to give you guys about if you're doing adaptation pathway planning, why do you want this information and what are you trying to do with it? So this is based on that flooding analysis tool. Essentially, as you're planning your strategies, you're trying to guess on how many days might I see flooding and, what's our critical threshold? So your road, like I said, might have 10 days of flooding as your threshold. It might be 100 days of flooding. And so this tool actually allows you to put in the centimeters or inches that is your critical thresholds. And then you can see based on the sea level rise projections, what the probability of reaching that is in what decade. So to me, this is a really nice practical tool for community planners to start to think about how to use sea level rise scenarios in a way that really gets them to say, okay, well, we're comfortable with a 50% probability, or we're not comfortable with that. We want it to be even less of a probability. So this really gets into risk management decision-making. What's your risk tolerance? How do you want to accept that risk or not accept that risk? And a lot of that is political, it's social, it's economic. So there is physical data that's involved with it, but much of it is, those decisions are made by us. Those decisions are made by people. And so there is really an opportunity here for like interdisciplinary work. So the other piece that I want to talk about is while we're trying to figure out how those hazards are increasing, we know we have vulnerable areas. What can we do about it? There's a lot being talked about in nature-based solutions. I focus on coastal dunes with a number of researchers across the state. So we have this Coastal Dune Science Partnership. You'll see on the left, these are all these dune restoration or experimental dune projects that are happening up and down California. And so we've gathered together as a network where we're pooling our information from these projects, where we just actually got a big new UC Climate Action Grant to sponsor more fieldwork at these sites to monitor how these projects are doing and to monitor new ones that are coming online. And then we are taking a look at all that and trying to devise ways to understand how well these have performed. It's fairly complex because they're dunes. They don't stay in one place. They grow and they move. They interact with storms. Some have more vegetation than others. And so we're really trying to find ways that you can cross-compare different dune systems, different dune restoration approaches, and then advise communities in the state on sort of where areas are. Have this as my next slide. Yeah, what approaches are best suited for what types of resilient goals? Like, are you trying to keep the water from flooding over the top? Or do you actually care about the dune habitat in the system, as in our 30 by 30 goals here in the state? Like, it's a dune habitat and we value that for just the habitat value, and we want to preserve it going forward or into the future as long as possible. And then how is dune resilience being integrated then into your sea level rise adaptation plan? Is sort of, do you think will it survive 3 feet of sea level, or will it only survive 1.5 feet of sea level? And is there ways that you can help it rebuild itself even higher, or is it not possible? Is it constrained by roads behind it, estuaries, it can't move, and so eventually it gets flooded? So understanding what the timeline of the performance of the dune is, and then how it actually is achieving the goals that you set out for. And reason this is also really important is because, again, tying back to financing and economics, there's a lot of interest from like the Department of Insurance in California and risk and insurance groups on potentially in helping to invest in things like coastal dunes if we can demonstrate that they are that they are mitigating flooding and are protecting from flooding. But right now, we really don't have a good methodology for evaluating how well the dunes are doing during these storms. So that's what we're trying to build, because we want to be able to have people invest in them more, but we also have to sort of create the data to create the proving ground that they're actually working. So if you're interested in experimental strategies around nature-based solutions, there's a ton of new work coming out there, and the Dune Science Network is a great place to get started. Other things that I wanted to mention is really talking about the community aspect. So finding ways for the community and new technologies to help us out. CoSnap, some of you may have heard of this. These are these cradles where you bring your own phone. It's set up with a certain perspective on the beach, and then you send your photos in, and the researchers are now using this to be able to see kind of how the shoreline is changing over time. This is actually one that just got put up in Baja, and we're trying to sort of build an entire CoSnap network across all of California, and then work with our Baja partners to support it down there. And that leads me to talk a little bit about the binational climate extension project, which, as I mentioned, is one of the projects that I support with Melissa, our fellow. And so this is really, she's based in Ensenada part-time, and so she's been working with researchers down there to better understand how they're monitoring beaches and dunes, what they're doing about kelp loss, where they're seeing fisheries impacts of climate change, how their communities and workforce, how their marine and coastal dependent workforce are being impacted. And so she's got 3 areas that she focuses on: coastal, as I mentioned, blue connections, which is workforce, but also public access. Also, a component of this is supporting tribes on both sides of the border to reconnect to the coast. And so we're building kind of a gap analysis to understand what people are doing, where we can build collaboration across the border. And then this is supported by the San Diego Foundation's Binational Resilience Fund. So we have some donors that are interested in trying to be able to support these partners across the border. Another example and last example I'll give you, I have no idea what my time is. Apologies, I didn't pay attention. But is we just launched another fellowship in Fort Bragg. And this is me working with the city of Fort Bragg and the larger greater Mendocino region. And they have launched this Noyo Ocean Collective that focuses around Noyo Harbor and beyond. And this is a really important area for Mendocino because this is workforce, this is fisheries, this is coastal resilience, this is everything to the community is kind of based around this area. So we're going to support a 2-year fellow that's going to look at sea level rise and hazards. They're going to look at how they're going to rebuild the Noyo Harbor to support potentially things like feasibility of aquaculture, new fisheries, jobs, as well as like the broader sort of harbor itself. So I'm really excited about this project, and I think we have the fellows starting hopefully on November 1st. But if any of you guys are interested in helping Mendocino out, they're a very small community, and there's like 5 or 6 people doing everything. So anyone who wants to do an internship up there, they would absolutely love it. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. And I don't just quickly throw out a promotion to Rosanna Shaw, who is the LA Times writer. She just came out with this book, California Against the Sea, and she's doing a book tour right now. It talks a little bit about the work that I do at Scripps with the understanding flooding and our communities and how they're flooding. It talks a little bit about the dunes and a number of communities across California. And I think it's a really great piece that really gets to the element of how we as people need to sit down and kind of work together to revision our coastline. And I think the last thing I'll mention to you guys is that I do work for Sea Grant. We do have our state fellowships. And I think we just are assigning this year's, but you guys you could apply to the next year's cohort. It's a really great program where you're assigned to a number of state or regional or national federal entities in California. It's how I got my start and many of my other Miss colleagues. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me about that program. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hey, thanks, Laura. Yeah, we actually had 3 California Sea Grants last year. So we're rocking that. We have 2 who are in the final round right now, so they'll know in the weeks. Yeah, we love that program. Is like the perfect gateway, into your career. So I have 2 questions, and then we'll open it up here. One is very, very simple, but that thing, I hadn't seen it before about people taking the picture and and then putting it in the URL or whatever. Obviously, as people, who are surfers, right? We have Surfline, we have all these cameras on the oceans. Why do it in this kind of haphazard manner where kind of random people doing it instead of just kind of putting some cameras up that can kind of just monitor over the long term? Is it just logistics, cost, maintenance? What's the thinking?
It's a little bit of those. Frankly, it's the perspective on the beach. So not every beach is a good fit for it, but where there's kind of a headland or an upper elevation and you can see the whole beach, it is cheaper and it won't get stolen as much as a video camera does. We don't need a permit on a private home or something. Typically, the permits are a little easier to get. And frankly, again, in my personal perspective is that we need to get people out there and better, like, for them to see their pictures. Like, I want city councils to start showing these, like, hey, this is what we have. This is what our beach has been looking like. And so I think that there's this gap between what people go to the beach, they see it in one static moment. But now if we have all these photos, we can actually create this like compiled video archive of the photos. That's really amazing to see how the beach changes over the season and over the year. And so it is an easier, cheaper, cost-effective way, but it also does the job pretty well.
Okay. No, good. And, just, it's not a coastal example, but I walk my dog in this forest that's by a river, and obviously last year was record rains and everything, and I was amazed that like entire sections are completely different now. Like there was a beach and a pathway, and now it's like it's unrecognizable, in just one season, right? So it's a good education for people. So I think that element you lose with a video camera up there.
Right. We quickly forget.
Right. Yeah, indeed. That's one of our superpowers is our short-term memories. So on the more kind of substantive question, I like how you're emphasizing, that this stuff is now, it's the kind of short, medium term, not all these climate models have to be, 50 years out or whatever. And we're seeing these big impacts. Do you think, you've been in this space, over a decade here, do you think the more of these immediate, short-term, kind of large-scale impacts is changing people's perception about kind of retreat, moving back, and that maybe there's some futility of really holding ground right at the edge there, or I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
It's a great question. I think that so when it comes to public property, there's always a difference between public and private. I think that when it comes to public property, our public agencies that have a stake in the coast took a big hit this year, right? And other years. And as their sort of repair logs start building up and the cost starts building up, you can't ignore it. So I think that like state parks and county, I'm in San Clemente. Congressman Levin just brought in whatever $1 or $1 billion to add sand to our beaches and Capistrano Beach under the guise of saving the rail line, but it's also to add, sand to the beach. So clearly there's enough information that is getting some political push for, nourishment, which is again still a short-term strategy, not a long-term strategy. But the fact that people are recognizing that that needs to be done, and I think that a lot of funds that are coming out of DC right now are being used to hopefully sort of create some of these resilience strategies, elevate roads, move parking lots, things like that. Now, when it comes to private homes, it's a tough question because I think that not every community, I have a hard time picking apart, I think each community has its own storyline, right? And so you got to think about the fact that, are there options for those people? Like there's an area in around San Francisco Bay where it is literally the last standing affordable housing on the South Peninsula, and it is vulnerable to flooding. So asking people to retreat out of those homes and apartments is an unequitable ask, if you will. So now if you're the city of Del Mar, it's a different question, although if you take the front line of the homes away, they're actually protecting the whole neighborhood behind it. So you have a huge loss of virtually a third of the city. And so that's also a big question of like, does the city exist anymore if all of that is gone? They definitely couldn't afford to pay for one of those homes, much less 50 of those homes. And so I guess I have been I've been watching what the insurance industry is doing because I think a lot of it's market driven, right? And I think the insurance industry is starting to drive those housing markets in other states, in Florida and North Carolina and other spaces. They're just kind of creeping into California. That may change the cost of housing for people, and that may change their mind about their like openness to moving or selling.
Great. Before we get the other questions here, and I'm glad we got a nice lineup. Just on that point, I will forward people some recent articles I think, Laura, you're alluding to about insurance. And this is the key point, right? That a lot of people are buffered by state subsidies of insurance. So they're not seeing the true risk, right? And this is, again, it's one of these really interesting things where you say, let the market work is probably the best thing for climate adaptation, because high insurance means high risk. And if you buffer people from high risk, they're going to take the risk, right? So it's kind of basic economics. So thanks for pointing that out, Laura. And we'll go Kevin, Adiba, and Lily in that order.
Hi, Laura. My name is Kevin. It's great to have you here, and thank you so much for your presentation. And I apologize, I'm in two screens. I originally started on my phone, and then I logged on my computer to get a better view of your presentation. Um, what you were saying and your whole presentation really echoed for me, because I live here in Alaska, and we actually have a similar issue, but we don't really have insurance that covers coastlines because a lot of people don't build on the coast here in Alaska, but my department hosts the local environmental observer network, and it is basically a platform where people across the state and from around the country really are able to look at these different changes in everything in like plants and animals in coastlines and different changes. And I'm not sure if you heard, but this past few months ago, we had the worst storm on record in Western Alaska, which was Typhoon Merbok, and it caused a lot of flooding across the state, the worst that it's ever seen. And I love your co-snap. And I have to say, I'm glad Jason brought that up because it's such a simple yet effective way. And also too, I mean, even if like for citizen science, I just imagine like having a permanent setup where people can just go out and like fit their phone inside this like laid out portrait. So it's like taken so constantly, you know. I definitely want to bring that to my team and think about that because that is just really fascinating to me, and I think that's such a great idea. And lastly, too, with your adaptive planning, the script that what you sent, I was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit more about that because I saw your criteria in there, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you determined what the criteria was and like what the cost was and kind of who was completely involved in that because the graphic was really nicely laid out and very beautiful. And I think that that's something as us as students could maybe benefit from learning how to create. And I feel like in another class that I'm taking, we're learning a little bit about that, and I just have to kind of give kudos to that. And lastly, my last comment is that here in Alaska, my department is actually the Climate Initiatives Department. They're actually actively relocating two communities from the coast that have been completely washed away. And you know, the question is these communities don't exist anymore. They've actually been renamed at their new locations. And so your question that you're saying, will the city be a city? In Alaska, we actually have already met that, and we actually have had to say goodbye to the old city and say hello to the new city. So the town of Newtok is no longer there. It is, but it's slowly being moved over to Matarvik, and all the old facilities and landfill are still being eroded into the coast because there's no viable cleanup solution for that contamination and for the old buildings and sites there and landfill. So just again, thank you very much for your insightful perspective into coastal management because it's very relevant here in Alaska and especially with like a warming Arctic. So I'm going to end that there, but thank you.
No, thank you for bringing that up. I think I'm always, we live in a very privileged world, especially in Southern California. And so I work with a number of partners from Sea Grant in Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and I haven't talked too much with the Alaska folks, but similarly, they always bring the reality back to me because we're barely seeing impacts here, but in other communities like yours, these are right at the door, if not already, like you said, people have had to adapt. And I think that like your experiences around that, you should share those because now you are actually resilience experts as opposed to those who haven't had to go through that. So it's sort of like those who have faced that hardship are actually coming out with the like lessons and things that are really valuable to share. As far as CoSnap, yeah, check it out. And I also, if you have friends in the tech industry and things, get them involved. Like there's a lot of ways that the new generation with all the different types of visual tools that we have available. That's what I'm saying is like we have this opportunity to get people better engaged. You might be able to fly drones up there and do aerial imagery, whereas we can't because of all of our military bases and stuff. We get stuck a lot with the drones, but in rural areas, drones can be super helpful to map the coast. The last thing, the adaptation plan, I cannot take credit for that. It's actually, it is the most sophisticated one I've found. And it is San Mateo County. So that's south of San Francisco. I can dig up that link and send it to you. But they did a great job of actually thinking about all the different components and it is the most sophisticated one out there that I've seen so far.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, so Diba, you're next.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for today's presentation. It was really thoughtful. My question goes to your career. I just wanted to know, how did you start? How the journey after your graduation? It's just off the topic a little bit, but I'm curious about to hear about your journey post your graduation from Miss. That how you started. You directly started with a works of your corely related to economics or climate change, or
Yeah.
you went and worked in general positions like project management, program management, and then try to bring your emphasize on the main topic that you want to work until you join Center for Climate Change Impact and Adaptation.
Yeah. So I did kind of break my ground in terms of understanding coastal economics with Jason, and I actually did some work in analyzing some of the original NOAA, NOEP data, the National Ocean Economics data with Judy Kildow. And that has framed like my understanding of how direct and indirect impacts sort of, bringing that into the work. And I'm personally just really interested in how things are financed and why investments are made. So I've kind of taken that along in my career. But after I finished Miss, I became a Sea Grant state fellow, and I had the privilege of working for the California Ocean Protection Council when it was in its infancy. So I was a state fellow with them for a year, and then they kept me on. And I had actually a shared position. I worked with OPC on everything from offshore wind and wave development back then, which has now come all the way back around to desalination, collaborative fisheries research, a whole bunch of different stuff. But I had a chance to interact with scientists and researchers and start to understand how science is communicated and translated, and then how it influences policy, which has really helped me a lot in my career. I also shared my position with the State Coastal Conservancy at that time. And so I worked in the Central Coast in Santa Cruz, Monterey area, and I did some watershed restoration and actually worked on the removal of San Clemente Dam for 3.5 years, which is a giant project on the Carmel River. And then I decided that I didn't want to work for the state anymore because I wanted to get a little bit more experience at the local and regional level. And there was I had moved to Southern California. There was a new initiative being started here by the San Diego Foundation, the Port of San Diego, and I can't remember a couple of cities at that point in time. And they were starting what's called the San Diego Climate Collaborative. And it was this mostly city staff and agency staff, that at that time, there wasn't an actual climate change position. They were all land use planners or in public works or environment departments, but they were trying to move climate action planning, and not even adaptation quite yet, but climate action planning, greenhouse gas emission plans, and then adaptation plans forward. And they hired me on to launch their regional network. And so we did everything from training. I brought in experts, we brought in scientists, and then we talked about how to use that information in their city and how to guide land use planning and energy planning and public work planning. So that was really helpful for me to see the internal side of the city and how they were doing things. And then I got a NOAA grant to do a regional sea level rise planning effort in San Diego. And so I helped launch that and brought in a whole bunch of different cities so we could talk about how we were like understanding the latest sea level rise projections. So that's kind of how I got back into that. And then Scripps was launching this new center, and I happened to go to who's now my director, Mark. And I was trying to explain to him that he shouldn't start from scratch in terms of working with people in San Diego, that I could help him do that. And he said, well, actually, do you want a job with me? And I said, oh, yeah, that sounds like something I might want to do. So I moved into the Scripps world, and And then California Sea Grant was based there, and they sort of came and recruited me to become a part of their family again. So I just kind of did full circle. But I've job hopped a lot, but I always feel like I'm trying to kind of like jump onto new ideas. I put a lot of effort into launching new things. It's sometimes pretty tiring, but I just keep doing it. Every 4 or 5 years, I keep finding something new and kind of innovative, and then I'm like, yeah, that sounds good. I want to try that. So be adventurous. Try it.
That's
Thank you
awesome.
so much for sharing this.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, Lily, you're up, and then Mary.
Thank you so much for this talk. I actually have 2 quick questions related to what you're talking about with the sand. The first was that you mentioned that the sand is going away, and I hadn't really heard that. Is that just because of construction, or is there something else going on? And then the second piece was just about what you mentioned about the politician bringing in sand, and I'd also never heard about that. And I was just wondering about the process of doing that, and if that has an impact. And also, it doesn't seem very sustainable long term to do in a lot of places, but I'd just love to hear a little bit more about that.
I'm going to guess you might be in Northern California. If you come down to Southern California, sand is everything everyone talks about. But,
I'm actually in Connecticut, so we think
okay.
about sand even less out here.
Okay, go to New Jersey and North Carolina, and they're all talking about sand nourishment. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah. So especially in a lot of places in California, we have dammed our rivers, and our rivers in California are one of the primary ways that we get sediment down to our beaches, and it naturally restores, and then it sort of trickles mostly down the coast. There's what are called littoral cells, so there's sort of like a circulation of sand in a certain region. But in general, we have stopped our sand flow with dams. And then we also have developed on the coast, which doesn't allow the cliffs to erode, which contributes also an additional component of sand to our beaches. And so where we've armored, we don't allow our cliffs to sort of erode and add to it. Where we've dammed, it doesn't add to it. And so the fix in the East Coast has always been as well is to go and take sand where it's piling up in harbors or other or offshore sites, because sand moves offshore, and to come pile it back onto the beach. It's quite expensive, but the Army Corps of Engineers loves to do it. So historically, they've done a lot of it, and mostly in Southern California, we don't have as much money to do that, but we often have to dredge our harbors, like LA Harbor and other harbors, for vessel safety. And so that sand then gets put back on the beach in a lot of places to help sort of buffer it.
All right, thank you. Mary, you're up.
All right. Thank you so much, Laura. Can you hear me okay? I have these. Okay, great. Sometimes they don't work properly. So I was kind of wondering about your engagement with communities a little bit. And when you speak with communities, like, what are people most worried about? And then kind of a secondary question, do you ever look at social media and use that to kind of create a narrative? Because I know, like, with crazy weather events, people are always posting pictures on there as well. And do you ever use that?
Great question. So right now I'm trying to take on 2 students to help me. So I have data that tells me when we should have seen flooding in the past based on like a model that looks backwards, and from like Santa Barbara to San Diego. And I now bring on 2 students who are going to look at everything: newspapers, lifeguard reports, but we're looking 20 years back, and social media is pretty new. So you can find some stuff on social media and YouTube in the last like maybe 5 to 10 years, but going further back, it's mostly newspapers or other types of reports. And in some places, lifeguards are really, I found we had another project where a student went actually to the lifeguard station, went through paper logs and took photos and gathered information. So it is talking to a whole bunch of different people, because each community might have a different resource for that. Sometimes they have their historical society has stuff too. So yeah, but it's a great question. So going forward, I would imagine that social media would be maybe a good source for it. I skipped a little bit over community engagement, but please don't, to me, it is absolutely critical. And I am a big fan of, actually, I will quote one of my favorite colleagues and friends is, talk once and listen twice. It's something we say to everyone when we are working, in particular, introducing them to tribal communities. Because we Westerners like to talk a lot. We don't always listen very well. And so I think with, community engagement, part of what is unique about where we are in this situation with sea level rise is it does open the door for sort of rethinking what our coast looks like. And in many cases, that's looking backwards. That is reconnecting. Here in Southern California, our tribes had land at the coast. Now they're way far inland. And so we're trying to reestablish what they would like to see out of coastal access and coastal restoration. What species and plants are important to them? What areas are important to them? So I think every conversation is a little different. If I talk to the Port of San Diego, they want, the things that are important to their port infrastructure, but the other communities around San Diego Bay that share that area with the port want, space for lease turns, want the tidal wetlands restored. And so we have to be able to have these conversations, and we have to be able to hear everyone, but then we need to also think about what we're valuing, because a lot of things that we're valuing are quite new, right? They were established or built in the last 50 years. And let's actually rethink that. So there is a lot of emphasis at the Coastal Commission on, critical infrastructure and roads in the next 100 years. And I always want to say, cars were not actually invented that long ago. So maybe we won't need roads in 100 years. I could just think optimistically. Maybe we should think about shifting not just our road infrastructure, but our entire road behavior. That would be a totally different coastline if we didn't have to have cars on the coast. So, we have a lot of change. We have a lot of power plants that are potentially going to go away. What are we going to do with that land? Should we rethink how it's being used after those are, broken down and retired? So I think that there are real opportunities here for sort of having community conversation, not just assuming that the people that are living on the coast are the only people that you should talk to, because it is a bigger conversation and everyone deserves equitable access and a voice in it, right?
That's a great point. I love that kind of ending on the opportunity, right? We always kind of think of saying no to stuff, but it's also re-envision, I did see Kevin had one quick question, maybe just on the last minute here, about any contaminants in the dredged, sand and stuff from these. And is that an issue? I imagine it is. And how is it dealt with?
I think there's more concern about the contaminants than I think ends up being the contaminant. So there's especially Humboldt Bay is a community that is also struggling with sea level rise today. They have some areas that are severely eroding. So they are definitely a community that's pushing what we call sediment reuse permits. So they're trying to figure out how to work with all these federal and state agencies to allow them to grab sand where it's moving and it's not helping the situation, and then sort of use it to buffer other areas in the bay. I think Santa Cruz has also been looking at it. So yeah, it's got a lot of agencies involved, of course, because there's toxics and contaminants and everybody, but it is a conversation. I do hope that it goes somewhere, because I think that there could be a lot of benefit.
Right on. All right, well, we're right at 7 here, so great timing. I think these are great questions. It was a great discussion. Laura, you kind of are good, you're good model for the Miss way here of kind of getting the grant and then doing cutting edge things. And again, it's one thing if you jump around, but you're in the same kind of space, right? So you're advancing in the same space, and like you said, you came full circle, right? So that's amazing. So we look forward to seeing you in person one day, hopefully not too long. And thanks so much. And great work.
Yeah, and again, I am quite open. I get a lot of emails, but I always enjoy hearing from Miss students. So don't be shy. email me if you want to connect even with some of the other Sea Grant. Check out our extension staff and who they are and where they're working across the state, and I'm happy to connect you to any of them as well. They're great resources.
Awesome.
I wish I could have seen you guys in person, but
another
glad,
time.
thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, everybody, have a great evening. Thanks for being here. Take care.
Bye.